Hi you guys, so I'm just recording this video just for anyone who couldn't make the online session tonight. I'm going through some reminders for your unseen poetry exam next week, and I'm also going to cover a little bit on A Christmas Carol to do with the topic of the Cratchits. Okay, so first off, let's start with a few reminders about your unseen poetry exam. So this exam has two sections in. You've got a 20-minute analysis of a single poem and then a 40-minute comparison between that first poem and a second poem. Okay, let's start by thinking about section A. So the first thing to mention is, over this whole paper, you must use the full hour. You can pick up a lot of marks here. It's like a gold mine. Unseen poetry is not something that you can revise for. It's something that you can just get on the day. It's something you can practice for and prepare for, but you just don't know what poems you're going to get. So it's an ideal opportunity to really show off your skills. Remember, the examiner is looking for you to be thoughtful and opinionated. It's fine for you to have your own interpretation of the text, and you don't always have to get it right either. If you have a good opinion or a thoughtful opinion on a phrase or a word or an image in the poem, they've got to award you something for that if it's thoughtful and as long as it's sensible. Okay, so really go for it and don't be shy. For the section A, single poem response, I'm going to give you a short acronym just to help you to remember some of the things you need to write about. That is C list. So the C stands for content. The first thing you should do when you get your poem in the unseen poetry exam, after highlighting all the bits that you want to write about and making sure you understand it, is just go through the poem and explain what happens in it. So tell the examiner, this is what happens in the beginning, this is what happens in the middle, this is what happens at the end. Okay, show that you understand it. The L stands for language. So you need to pick out, I would say, at least 5 quotations, something from the beginning, middle, and end, and you need to thoughtfully explain those quotations and what they could show. Okay, so you're analysing the quotes. The I stands for imagery. Now, helpfully, all of the poems that we've been given, they always include a real whopper of a simile or something really obvious, a really obvious metaphor that you can't miss. Find that simile or metaphor and use that as an opportunity to explain it. You're saying things like, well, this could mean, or perhaps it could mean, this makes me feel that. So you're really explaining and developing. The S stands for structure. Sometimes people forget to write about the structure. It does remind you to do this on the bullet points of the question. The structure means how the poem is put together. Is it chronological? Does it have a regular structure where it's got like a 4-line stanza, another 4-line stanza, regular rhyme? Or is it really chaotic? Is it like free verse all over the place, totally irregular? If it is, try and think about why that might be and why that might link in with the poem's theme. The other thing to try and spot, and the exam board love to put these poems in, is if there's a moment where something changes in the poem. Does it suddenly become angry? Does it suddenly become sad? If you can pick out that moment of change, then you've written about structure. The T stands for tone. Is there an angry tone? The tone is like the mood. Angry, nostalgic. Has it got a tone of melancholy or sadness? Is it joyful and excited? Um, think about the mood. So that's the whole vibe of the poem. Think about what's going on. Okay, so that's section A. Now, section B. This is a bit longer. This is a bit like an essay. So this is 40 minutes. This is kind of a job where you're doing an introduction, lots of developing paragraphs, and a conclusion. The most important thing to remember for section B is lead with that second poem. You've already written about the first poem, so this section B should mainly be about that second poem. The ratio you're looking for is 70-30. 70% second poem, 30% links back to the first one, okay? Now, to do that, when you're writing about the second poem, once you get to the end of each paragraph, make a quick link back to the first poem. So you're saying this, and this, and then you go, this is similar to the first poem because, or this is different to the first poem because. And then you go like that. So remember that ratio, 70-30. If you run out of comparisons and you think, well, there's nothing else I can say, or I can't compare that, don't worry. Just write about the second poem on its own. You will still pick up marks. So if you run out of comparisons, that's fine. You pick up marks for writing about the second poem on its own. All right? Now, in your conclusion, and you will need a little conclusion, here's what I would do. I would finish by giving a bit of an overview, a bit of a summary, and then I would say what each poem made you feel and how you responded. So, what your opinion is on the poems. You could even tell the examiner which was your favourite poem and why. They like that. It shows that you're being thoughtful. It might be a good opportunity to point out the different messages that the poems have. Have they got a similar kind of message? Have they got a different message? Okay. Right, so that's for your unseen poetry. I'm going to move into a little bit of Cratchit essay planning now. Now, I do think this would be a good question to prepare for next week, because if we got a question on family, we got a question on the Cratchits, it would, cover both bases. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through 3 different sections. So you might want to make a bit of a mind map with 3 different sections on. I'm just going to, hang on a minute, I'm just going to turn down, I've got some dinner cooking, I'm just going to turn it down on the hob. There, we don't want to have a dinner disaster. Right, so the first thing that you need to think about is why Dickens actually uses the Cratchits in the novel. There's a reason that they're there, and they've got a function in the novel. Now, this links in with context, which of course you are tested on in this exam. Right, so the first reason that Dickens uses the Cratchits is he wants to show what the reality of life was like for the Victorian poor in 1843. Rich people did not have much contact with poor people in those days. There was such a divide between rich and poor. They lived in different areas, that they didn't really understand the experiences of the other. And although poor people might work for the rich, for example, as servants or maids, or Bob Cratchit for Scrooge, they never really kind of crossed paths at any other point. So Dickens really thought that the views of the Victorian rich were kind of skewed, and they were sort of built on stereotypes. So he wanted to show what actually the poor could be like. And he did that through the Cratchits. Okay, the next thing that reason that Dickens used the Cratchits was as a catalyst for Scrooge's transformation. Would Scrooge have changed if he hadn't have seen Tiny Tim? I don't think so. So by seeing the reality of Bob's life, and realizing that if he doesn't help Tiny Tim, that this child is going to die, and it will be his fault because he has not provided for Bob's family sufficiently for them to be able to care for Tim. So, it is going to be Scrooge's fault if Tiny Tim dies. So they give the novel a reason for Scrooge to change. Okay, now the next reason is that he wanted to challenge the stereotypes of the poor, as I've said. So the Victorian rich, Dickens believed that they had this view of the poor, that they were idle, lazy, or immoral, that they were inherently bad people. Now, by showing the Cratchits as good, moral Christians and almost impossibly pure and good, then he challenged those stereotypes. Now, the final thing that he wanted to show, and this works well for an essay on family as well. Now, Dickens had a really big family. I think he had about 12 children. Don't quote me on that. I might be wrong. I'll have to Google that. He had a lot of children, had a really big family. Now, Dickens had quite a difficult family life growing up as well, didn't he? His father was sent to debtor's prison, and Dickens had to go out and earn money for the family. So if there's anyone who knows what it is like to be part of an unstable family, it's Dickens. He knows a lot about family life, and he had this really strong view, as a lot of Victorians were starting to have, because the Victorian era is kind of the birth of the modern family as we know it. They had this view that the family was actually something that was really beneficial for society and that it provided stability in times of uncertainty and certainly a lot of security when it came to illness and to poverty. Just think of how the family, the Cratchits, care for Tiny Tim. So his message was, if we protect the family and we value the family as a society, then that can only be a good thing for all of us, for the whole country. So the next thing that you would need to know is the different staves where the Cratchits appear. You will have an extract from the novella, but you'll only be writing about that for about 10 or 15 minutes. The majority of your marks will come from your knowledge of the novel as a whole. So, the Cratchits appear, believe it or not, in every single stave of the novel. The first stave, we find out Scrooge's treatment of poor Bob in his dismal little cell with his one coal. We find out that he's treated very badly by his employer. In stave 2, we don't meet the Cratchits, but they are referenced briefly. When Scrooge goes to Fezziwig's, he realises that as an employer, Fezziwig was remarkably kind and charitable and welcoming and generous, and Scrooge learnt nothing from him. So when he sees Fezziwig, he says to the spirit, "I should like a word with my clerk." And at that point, the reader starts to realise that Scrooge is showing regret and remorse for the way that he treated Bob. Now, the biggest bit that you will write about for the Cratchits is stave 3. Don't just go with the tiny pudding and the goose. We need to think about some of the other ways that the Cratchits are presented. So, firstly, we've got Martha Cratchit, who stayed up to stay at the factory to finish a good deal of work that they had, showing that the poor have a strong work ethic. We've got Tiny Tim and Bob, who were at church singing hymns and saying prayers, which shows that the poor, i.e., the Cratchits, are good, moral Christians. We've got Mrs. Cratchit and the rest of the family who raise a toast to Scrooge and they call him the founder of the feast. They show respect for Scrooge, regardless of his cruelty to Bob, because they acknowledge that Scrooge is actually the founder of their feast. He has provided Bob with a measly salary, but a salary all the same, and that has provided them with this meal. So they are grateful. We've got Mrs. Cratchit, who's brave in ribbons, which are cheap. She makes herself look festive to try and make an effort for the whole family, regardless of their poverty. You've got Peter Cratchit, who's wearing his father's old shirt, but is filled with pride and gratitude for it, even if it's a monstrous shirt collar. He's not embarrassed by it. He's grateful for the little that he has. There's loads there. And the biggest bit, obviously, is when Scrooge says, "Will the child live?" about Tiny Tim. And then he starts to realise that if he doesn't help this family, he is going to be responsible for their doom and their death. Stave 4, death of Tiny Tim. You would have to get that in as well. Poor Bob is so upset. He cries, "My poor child, my little child." And we find out how upset the family are, but also how much Tiny Tim was valued as well by them and how loved he was. Finally, in stave 5, we get the kind of image of the Cratchits coming full circle and we go back to the start. So the novel really ends in Scrooge's counting house, just like it started with Bob and Scrooge in the counting house, to really emphasise the different attitude that Scrooge has to Bob Cratchit now. To Tiny Tim, he became a second father, and he says he's going to endeavour to help their family and raise their salary. Now, the final thing that I would mention for the Cratchits is there's about 4 literary techniques that, depending on the extract you get, you might want to mention. The first of those is hyperbole. Some people think that the depiction of the Cratchits in this novel is really over the top. It is, and it's over the top and exaggerated for a purpose. So Dickens is really trying to hammer home. Remember, he wanted to deliver a sledgehammer blow is what he said to society. And he gives this really exaggerated sense of their goodness and purity. And that contrasts with the evil of Scrooge.